Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And our topic for today is On the Brink, Part 2. And also there's a new article by Pepe Escobar, which we'll be going over if we can get to it. So, well, I intended to go over a video from Scott Ritter this morning, actually Judge Napolitano and Scott Ritter. And I intended also to go over a video from Nima Alkersherd and Colonel Larry Wilkerson, which was about Scott Ritter and the warning that Russia had given to the West. But about an hour ago, a little more than an hour ago, a new video appeared. This was one from Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson is in Moscow attending the St. Petersburg conference, and this video was another warning. So I'm going to bring it up, and we're going to go right through it. And this is, I think, part 2 of On the Brink. Fits the topic absolutely perfectly. And this video is called Larry Johnson, Russia is Flashing Red. The West had better pay attention. And here's what Larry has to say. I'll interrupt as seems appropriate or necessary for commentary and analysis. Here we go.
Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, speaking to you from the sonar21.com channel. I want to call to your attention some recent statements by Sergei Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russia, and the deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov. That's Ryabkov. Both men are serious professional diplomats. I've had the privilege of meeting Mr. Ryabkov, and I can tell you that in person, he is a quiet professional. He is quite underspoken. He is not given to bombast, certainly not given to idle threats. If you're meeting just for pleasantries, he's very pleasant to talk to. So I was floored when I heard him say the following today.
Folks, just want to take a moment to ask for your support today. Not a single donation.
Sorry,
Commenting
anything
on
about that interruption.
the Biden administration's decision to allow Ukrainian strikes into Russia using American arms. He said that the Biden administration's move may have fatal consequences. He went on to say that,
Of course, I gave that warning in my stream last night, the On the Brink stream. But this is a warning that's coming directly from the deputy foreign minister of the Russian Federation to Larry Johnson, who's in Moscow for the St. Petersburg economic conference, very large conference, supposedly 25,000 people were going to be attending that conference. So I'll continue now.
For unknown reasons, the Biden administration underestimates the seriousness of the rebuff they may receive. And he went on to comment he was concerned about Ukrainian attempts to strike Russia's strategic radar system. These are the early warning systems that Russia relies on to notify it that a potential nuclear attack from the United States or Europe is underway. This comment by...
Okay, I should say at this point, for those who don't know, that Larry Johnson is a former member of the CIA who had a specialty in Russian intelligence and Russian studies. He's been a guest. He has his own channel called Sonar 21, but he's been on the Judging Freedom show at least twice a week for some time now. He recently gave a speech to the UN, which was an excellent speech on the crisis in Israel, if I recall correctly. It was on that crisis. But it was an excellent, excellent speech. Larry is a very forthright individual, very direct in his manner of speaking, and an excellent analyst.
Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov needs to be heard loud and clear in the halls of Washington. But it's not just Mr. Rybkov saying this. It's Sergei Lavrov, the dean of foreign ministers really in the world. He's probably the most respected foreign minister there is out there.
I couldn't agree more with that assessment. I gave it myself, actually, just yesterday, using similar words. He is an amazing foreign minister, brilliant in his use of words. He's brilliant in his analysis. And he's a person one should always take seriously and listen to.
He is the consummate professional. And again, he reiterated the very same warnings that his deputy foreign minister, Mr. Rybkov, issued. The way Russia is looking at this is when the United States, if it does decide to deploy an F-16 to Ukraine, Russia has to assume, as the United States would assume, if Russia did the same thing and deploying a combat aircraft capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, if they deployed that to Cuba, the United States would take notice and would have to assume the worst, assume that, in fact, Russia would be preparing to strike us, and we would take appropriate measures. First, warning the Russians, and then if they didn't heed our warnings, striking back. Well, guess what? The Russians inhabit that same kind of world. They're looking not only at the United States, actively now encouraging and supporting Ukraine use of ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and possibly German Taurus missiles that can fly up to 300 miles inside Russia. And the Russians have to be concerned and are expressing the concern that they can't be confident that the United States is not deploying a nuclear-tipped warhead. This has become an especially acute concern on the part of Russia in light of last week's drone attacks on these strategic radars that are used to detect inbound intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Okay, I've talked about this before, of course, those drone attacks were a very stupid idea. They've raised the level of danger in this situation by an order, of magnitude, because they destroyed one of the early warning radars, of Russia, and therefore forced the Russians to go on to full alert until that radar, is fixed. Now, that radar had no significance for the Ukraine war whatsoever. The only reason for the Ukrainians to attack it with the aid of the West, and it had to be with the aid of the West, the only reason for them to attack that particular radar was for the Ukrainians, the reason would be to drag the United States into and NATO into a full-scale war, against Russia. Why the United States would allow such an attack, and it had to give its consent because we had to do the targeting, we had to do the satellite reconnaissance, we had to do the setup of the drones. So, for us to give the okay for this was an act of reckless madness.
There is no justification for attacking those radars. They do nothing to advance Ukraine's cause in fighting the land war against Russia in Ukraine.
So Larry just said it himself.
Jennifer Wexton has endorsed Suhas Subramaniam, praising him as a principled, effective leader. Suhas served as a firefighter, EMT, and advisor to President Obama, and fought to keep our kids safe from gun violence. Vote Suhas for Congress by June 18th.
Sorry.
The only possible.
Of course, I had no control, over that. I will say that Suhas appears to be another establishment product of the Virginia Democratic machine. He formerly was in the Obama White House. I am finding an alternative someone to vote for if we all last that long.
Reason for launching that kind of attack is to take out Russia's early warning system. Accordingly, this has caused a dramatic shift in Russia's rhetoric on this issue. And they are warning that they will not hesitate to retaliate and to take preemptive, proactive measures. These folks are not playing. They are dead serious. And by
the phone that's ringing in the background is Larry's phone. It's not mine. It just happens to be a matter of coincidence that Larry is using the same phone ringer that I have. It's something called the Call of Sherwood Forest or something like that. Anyway.
virtue of being dead serious, they're trying to put the United States on notice. The problem is many in the United States positions of decision-making within both the Biden White House, State Department, and apparently CIA are dismissing these as idle threats.
Did I mention Larry was retired CIA?
From what I have observed, as I've monitored Russian military actions since the start of the special military operation, Russia doesn't make idle threats. Russia is very upfront about stating its objectives, what it intends to do, what it views as a red line, as something that must not be crossed. The West is making the mistake of assuming that past Russian patience and not retaliating, for example, with drone strikes that hit the Kremlin, that this is a sign of Russian weakness or Russian fear. It is no such thing. It is a sign of Russian patience. But we in the West are mistaking Russian patience for Russian stupidity. And that is the fatal error that I think Sergei Rybakov had in mind when he issued this warning the other day. I think it is incumbent upon every American to contact their member of Congress, their senator, and tell them, we don't want to go to war with Russia. We don't want to risk a nuclear war with Russia. We need to sit down and talk to the Russians. Even during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was one of the last times that we came so close to entering into a nuclear war with Russia. It was then the Soviet Union. Even during that crisis, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the president, John F. Kennedy, was talking to the Russians directly. They were communicating. It turned out back in that crisis, there was a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding on both sides. Even the president, John F. Kennedy, did not realize prior to this event that the United States had deployed nuclear-capable missiles in Turkey that could reach Russia, which was why Russia in turn was giving us a taste of our own medicine. And boy, when we got a taste of them putting missiles into Cuba, we didn't like it one bit. And then we got angry without realizing that we had actually provoked this response by Russia.
By the way, at that very time, during that crisis, as a very young man, I was in the streets of Lansing, Michigan, protesting the crisis and urging trading of the Russian missiles in Cuba for the U.S. missiles, in Turkey, in order to resolve the problem.
Or the then Soviet Union. That crisis ended peacefully because cooler heads prevailed. I am very, very concerned that we do not have cooler heads right now in Washington, either on the Democrat side and in the person of the feeble, demented Joe Biden, or his equally feckless, inept Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or the incompetent Jake Sullivan. None of these people understand the kind of nuclear fire that they are playing with and putting the citizens of the United States at risk. Likewise, on the Republican side, there are very, very few voices. I think only J.D. Vance and Rand Paul on the Senate side are the only ones trying to talk reason and common sense and encourage the opening of talks and negotiations to ease tensions. Instead, the Biden administration is pouring fuel on a fire, and this is not a conventional fire. This is a fire with nuclear consequences. I wish I had a cheerier message for you today, but I cannot help but underscore the urgency of paying attention to what senior Russian officials are now saying. They're not kidding. They're not trying to blow smoke up your ass. They're not bloviating and making idle threats. They mean what they say. And I think we need to pay attention. Thank you for listening.
So, That was a hugely serious warning. Of course, I gave you a similar warning in my program, of yesterday, but his hearing it directly from Ribikoff is very significant. Since he knows him. He didn't say whether he heard it as a statement or he got it in conversation, with Ribikoff, whom he knows. That doesn't really matter. What matters is it was a direct and serious warning. And when they say there will be fatal consequences for continued activity of this type, they mean fatal consequences. I went over some of the facts of the military situation before you yesterday when I played and commented on a video involving Colonel McGregor, also from the Judging Freedom Program. That video is very explicit about the military situation. Also, I went over an article, by Ron Unz that was very, very explicit about the military situation and the crisis we face. I'm going to continue now with some more of this stuff. I'm now going to get to a Scott Ritter video from earlier today. It was again on the Judging Freedom Program. The Judges Program has been doing a tremendous public service with its stable, of guests that weekly speak about the military situations in Ukraine, and in Israel. And I urge you all to take in his programs. Anyway, I will now take this one off the screen. Evelina says, it is reasonable to believe that if Russia perceived they could be facing an existential threat, they would not be making idle threats, quote unquote. Yes, and the other point, to be made is that the West, the collective West, knows very well that it knocked out a long-distance early warning radar that Russia relied upon. So there was some reason for Russia perceiving that they could be facing an existential risk, as Evelina has put it. I'm going to go on now. By giving you the Scott Ritter video, sharing that from the Judges Program.
For Judging Freedom. Today is Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. My dear friend of the show, Scott Ritter, joins us now. Scott, a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for joining us. Of course, we didn't expect as recently as 2 days ago that we would be talking like this. We thought we'd be talking in person in Russia. But before we get to why I am not there, what happened to you yesterday at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York?
Well, I was in the process of doing the final boarding of the aircraft where, right before you cross the threshold into the airplane, the airline attendants asked, just to review your tickets and your passport. And I handed it to them. They motioned to go on the airplane, and suddenly three uniformed, armed Customs and Border Patrol officers came up and asked if I was, William Scott Ritter Jr. I said, yes, I am. They ushered me out of the line. Then they demanded that I give them my passport, which I complied with. And then they asked me that if this was my only travel document, do I have any other travel documents? I said, no, this is my U.S. passport. It's the passport I use to travel overseas, and I have used frequently, including to Russia. And they said, well, we're seizing it. And I said, on what authority? They said, on the orders of the United States State Department. I said, who in the State Department? They said, we don't know. I said, well, who ordered you to do this? So you obviously are, we don't know. We can't tell you. We're not authorized to tell you. They wouldn't give me a receipt for the passport. They just said, you got to contact the State Department. I said, who in the State Department? They said, we don't know. You're going to have to figure that one out. Then they got my bags off the airplane and escorted me out of the security zone into the general, where you walk in, and said, you're free to leave. And that was that.
So, as we shall see as we go through tonight's content, we'll see that was seemingly an illegal and unconstitutional seizure of Scott Ritter's passport and a violation of his right to travel. It was a violation of the First Amendment. It was an act of unreasonable search and seizure, which is another violation of the Constitution. And we will talk about those things as we move through. By the way, Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson are also friends. And the plans were for Scott and the judge and Larry Johnson to meet up, in Russia. And at least for the judge and Scott Ritter to travel together to some large number of cities in Russia over 45 days on a people-to-people diplomatic mission of their own.
Do you have the names of or a photograph of any of the three of them?
No, I mean, I was, Judge, in retrospect, there's much that I should have done. I was in my mindset getting ready to get on an airplane and go to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I was focused on that. My mind was already what's going to happen when I land in Russia. And so this took me completely by surprise. And I failed to get the names of the three officers, and I failed to get a photograph. I mean, there are security systems all over the place. And, I am going to be making a call to the Customs and Border Patrol unit at the JFK to get the names of these officers. Whether or not they'll give them to me is another question.
Well, eventually you'll get all of this under the proper legal process, but they obviously interfered with your free speech rights, and you're protected by the First Amendment, and your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures protected by the Fourth Amendment, and what the Supreme Court has recognized, protected by several amendments, is your right to travel. Was I with you?
No, you weren't. Actually, you weren't with me because I made a phone call to you earlier in the morning, recommending that you not travel to Russia. And it had nothing to do with what happened to me and everything to do with what happened to our sponsor, Alexander Zyryanov, who, from my standpoint, tragically was placed under arrest in Novosibirsk on his way to St. Petersburg. We can discuss that in a moment if you'd like to. I did not, I like you. I consider you a friend, not just a colleague. And there was no way because I'm the guy who came to you and said, hey, Judge, you need to come to Russia. You need to do this. Let's make this happen. I got people that want to talk to you. they extended invitations to you. In retrospect, you could have gone to Russia, but I couldn't guarantee a positive outcome. And I am not going to be responsible for putting Judge Napolitano on an airplane into an unknown situation. Today, I now know that Alexander Zurianov's team, together with the presidential administration, had cobbled together a group that was going to receive us and lead us through the St. Petersburg Economic Forum to ensure no hassles, no anything.
Scott was supposed to give a presentation at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, as was Larry Johnson. That's why he was over there, as well.
That, nothing bad would have happened. But when I initially got this information, there's my good friend Alexander. When I got the information, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if this was reflective of a change in Russian government attitude or policy. And while I am dumb enough to get on a plane and fly into the unknown, hoping for the best, I wasn't going to be responsible for that happening to you. So I made a phone call, and I strongly recommended that you not get on that airplane. In retrospect,
we had that phone call about 5 a.m. as I was about to leave my house. The only reason I've asked you this is because of all these news reports that the same thing happened to me as happened to you. I am deeply and profoundly grateful for your friendship, which will be a lifelong friendship, for the care and courtesy you have for me as a person and for my public persona, and for these efforts to introduce me to people who are interested in what we have to say. And I know those efforts will be unending. You have a very, very serious case against the United States State Department. And many, many lawyers will happily bring that case for you in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, which sits in Brooklyn, but which covers events at JFK. You could also bring it in the Northern District of New York, up in New York State, where you live. You could bring it in either place. I can't imagine what conceivable defense there could be for this. No matter what you and I have said anywhere on the planet about Russia, about Israel, about Gaza, about Ukraine, about Joe Biden, about Vladimir Putin, it is all protected free speech. Protected because we have the natural right to speak, and expressly protected by the First Amendment. The same goes for your right to be free from unreasonable search and seizures. They didn't have a warrant. If they had a warrant, they would have shown it to you. And of course, they violated their own profound regulations by not giving you a receipt. They're supposed to give you a receipt so that when you sue them, the court will know who it is that took this away from you. Now you're going to have to do some investigation on your own. The State Department is huge. Was this Tony Blinken? Was this Jake Sullivan? Or was this some local functionary who didn't like something they heard you say?
By the way, Jake Sullivan is not actually part of the State Department. He's the National Security Advisor to Biden. He is part of the White House. But the State Department handles foreign travel documents. So there had to have been someone at the State Department, who initiated the taking of his passport, away from Scott Ritter. Very, very serious action, and a very serious imposition on Scott's freedom, to travel.
It's an outrageous abuse of power. It is profoundly unconstitutional, and I am aggrieved that you, my friend, were hurt by this.
But it's bigger than this, Judge. I mean, the State Department, using government appropriated monies for this purpose, created a Center for Countering Disinformation as an adjunct of the Ukrainian president's office. They did this in 2022. One of the first things that this Center for Countering Disinformation did, under the guidance and direction of the State Department of the United States, was to issue a blacklist of people that they called information terrorists. And on that blacklist were a large number of Americans, including myself. And this list, this center since that time, and here's the important thing about being called an information terrorist. That's a specific term being used by the Ukrainians, backed by the United States government. They said that an information terrorist must be hunted down and brought to justice the same way any terrorist would. And so I've been accused of saying things that make the Ukrainian government unhappy. They now say that I must be hunted down and arrested, detained, killed, as would any other terrorist in the world, and other Americans as well. They have made me, this center, again, with the U.S. State Department's support, has put out a list that, a weekly list where they say I'm the number one threat to truth about Ukraine. I'm the number one threat to Ukraine. I must be dealt with. They put out a monthly list where I top this list regularly. Plus, there's the Mirtvoritz hit list run by the Ukrainian intelligence services that I'm on, which marks you for death. They actually assassinate people. They have made 2 attempts against me on previous trips to Russia. The State Department has never condemned the Ukrainian intelligence services for marking U.S. citizens for death simply because they disagree with what they say. Free speech means nothing in the Biden America today. It actually, free speech has not only become something that gets you targeted for your passport removal, that's an inconvenience that I'm confident will be dealt with in due course. They're marking me for death, Judge, and that's something you don't come back from.
So this gives us, an understanding of how much courage Scott Ritter has. He's continuing his work now for a long time. During his trip to Russia, there were 2 attempts, on his life, evidently. He's topped this list of people compiled by the Ukrainians to be arrested and to be killed. So he's marked, for death, and the United States government in its foreign policy supports the marking of U.S. citizens for death because in the exercise of their rights of free speech, rights of free press, and other rights, they convey information that the government of Ukraine doesn't want to be conveyed. And instead of defending our citizens against the government, of Ukraine, our government uses the Ukrainian government to threaten our very citizens. They couldn't do this directly under the Constitution. They think they can get away with doing it indirectly by using another government. It is utterly, utterly outrageous.
And you're telling us that there's some purported NGO, which is actually funded by the State Department, that is behind this.
Well, it's behind the most recent outpouring.
An NGO is a non-governmental organization. So the people who compiled this list are from a non-governmental organization. They operate in Ukraine.
Of thing. The Center for Countering Disinformation is not an NGO. That's a government that works for the president, the office of the president in Ukraine. But it's organized.
So Scott clarifies that. I was mistaken. It's not an NGO. It's a government agency in Ukraine that works for the president.
Funded and directed by the State Department. When you look at the meetings where they promulgated the blacklist, in there they say, and at this meeting are the following State Department officials and the following officials from the United States Embassy. Now, one would imagine that at any meeting of this nature where somebody said, topping our agenda today is we're going to blacklist 40 American citizens for exercising for saying things we disagree with. At that juncture, duty demands that American government officials stand up and say, we object, you can't prosecute Americans for free speech. You can't use American money for this regard. But instead, the U.S. government sat there and supported this, facilitated this. And this is done on the direction of the U.S. Congress. This money was allocated by the U.S. Congress, voted on by the U.S. Congress, which appears to violate, again, not just the intent, but the letter of the law. Congress shall not pass any laws or legislation that are designed to infringe on the free speech of Americans.
Yes, in the hierarchy of law, the Constitution trumps any law passed by the Congress. That has to be kept in mind. If Congress passes a law that violates the Constitution of the United States, that law is not legal.
Congress gave the Ukrainian government money, which they're using to infringe on the free speech of Americans.
Another
Incredible, isn't it? Isn't it incredible?
example of the government attempting to do indirectly through another government what it can't do directly. So the American Congress, Joe Biden, allowed to spend this money however he wants. I think it's 165 billion at last count. He can spend it however he wants, and he's chose to spend some of it in this gaggle of people, Ukrainians and Americans, who have a list of people whom they want to silence and whom they want to kill. This is just not the America that the founders gave us, Scott. You are a remarkable example, not only of intellectual honesty, but of personal courage. As you know, because we are friends, I will be happy to work on this litigation with you. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope a couple of phone calls will return your passport. But there's much more of an aggrieved situation here, as you pointed out, than just the passport. And those of you watching ought to know, the world needs to know how corrupt the Joe Biden, Tony Blinken State Department is, that they would do something like this, pay to silence Scott Ritter, interfere with his freedom of travel, suppress his rights to free speech, and, I am sorry and almost terrified to utter this, threaten him with death. Well, we'll see where this goes, my dear friend.
Okay, I have to underline, this is not a new situation. They've been threatening Scott with death for years now. He's been on that list for years now. And the government of the United States just blithely accepts it, does nothing to protect the citizen of the United States against thugs coming from a corrupt government like the Ukrainian government, an incredibly corrupt government infiltrated by Nazis, by Ukrainian Nazis. And our government has done everything to hide the true nature of that regime from the American people, and has glorified some of the members of that regime, some of whom were Nazis. It's been a terrible, terrible thing. It's been going on for a long time. Okay, and it has to end. And now that suppression of Scott's rights was done, okay, in the context of warnings of the kind Larry Johnson gave, that Scott has been giving now for some time in his analyses of both of the military situation and the diplomatic warnings coming out of Russia.
Joe Biden has threatened Russians with death by publicly authorizing the Ukrainians to use American military equipment to attack inside Russia. How crazy is this?
It's the definition of insanity. First of all, the logic behind this. The Ukrainians have tried to create a narrative that says we can't defend ourselves from Russian aggression emanating from Russian soil unless we are allowed the use all the weapons that we possess. They forget that this is a special military operation that was initiated by Russia in response to Ukraine's 8-year war of aggression against the citizens of Donbass, whom they called terrorists, who then bombarded, killing hundreds of children, thousands of civilians. That this isn't a war. Russia didn't invade Ukraine. Russia sought to bring an end to the Ukrainian actions. And because the United States and other nations have decided to pour in hundreds of billions of dollars in financial and military assistance, this conflict has been extended and turned into a proxy war between Ukraine and Russia. This isn't about Ukraine wanting to use these weapons. This is about the United States and its NATO allies seeking to use Ukraine as a proxy to inflict the maximum possible damage on Russia.
That is an accurate characterization of what has been going on there. It's a characterization shared by Jeffrey Sachs and by Larry Johnson, by Colonel McGregor, also by Professor Mearsheimer, and numerous other analysts are aware of the true history of the origin of the Ukraine war. Our mainstream press has been lying about it, constantly calling it an unprovoked war. It was not an unprovoked war. There were 8 years of provocation before the Russians took a hand. There were provocations before that, but I'm just dating the start of the real war from 2014. That was the coup that that displaced a president of Ukraine who was duly elected by the people and who was attempting to walk a neutral, fine line between the collective West, and Russia. He was overthrown in this coup, and immediately after the coup, the new government, the coup government, began to oppress the Russian minority populations of the eastern part, of Ukraine, and Odessa.
But the fallacy here is they say, well, Russia can't be allowed to have a safe haven on Russian soil from which they get to launch an attack. Well, what do you think all of NATO and Europe is from the Russian perspective? It's a safe haven for Ukraine. You know, they train Ukrainian pilots. If that was training was done in Ukraine, they'd all be dead. We repair the Ukrainian equipment, American equipment, German equipment. We repair it on Polish soil, on German soil, in the Baltic states.
By the way, I have to add here that according to international law, Russia would be within its rights to attack the training centers and the repair centers in other countries being used to support the war, in Ukraine. The Russians haven't done that because they don't want, a wider war. They don't want to be goaded into a wider war. But they have the right to attack those particular sites, and they would be within their rights according to the law of nations.
Repair facilities are legitimate military targets. When you take a tank off the battlefield, take it back to repair it, to bring it back to the battlefield, that needs to be attacked. All the warehouses where we flow in these hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment on Polish soil, Romanian soil, etc., they can't be attacked by Russia. Ukraine has this massive safe haven, which Russia is powerless to attack. And this is the danger, because if we start playing this game and attacking the Russians have made it quite clear that they will retaliate, not just on Ukrainian soil, but on the soil of NATO nations. And this heads us down a very dangerous path that could very well lead to nuclear war.
Here's Foreign Minister Lavrov basically saying, we will not put up with this. Cut number 1.
We have shown that we will not put up with this, and that we will not allow Ukraine to be used as a direct threat to our security. as an instrument for the destruction of everything Russian on historical Russian lands. They did this for more than 2 decades, or even 30 years. Immediately after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, their goal was to destroy everything Russian, from the language to the government in this territory, which they wanted to take for themselves. And they were counting on it. But as always happens, if they wake up the Russian bear, then our people have united like never before. These are not empty words. We saw this during the Russian presidential elections. The Nazi regime continues to use Western weapons to attack civilian targets, towns, and cities. I assure you that they will not be able to cross this line unnoticed.
Does Joe Biden, does Tony Blinken, does Rishi Sunak, does Emmanuel Macron, does Olaf Scholz, does Donald Tusk, president of Poland, do these folks understand the significance of what Foreign Minister Lavrov said, and that the Russians don't bluff?
No, if they did, they wouldn't be going this far down this path. They are being advised by people who are saying that the Russians are bluffing, that the Russians lack the capacity to back these words up with meaningful force. There's even people who say, look, Russia's focused on the BRICS summit in October and, on bringing the non-aligned world together. Why would Russia risk, a war with the West? Well, because the West is threatening Russia's existential survival. And this is the danger. I mean, even President Putin came out today and said, this is a very dangerous game that's being played that will have fatal consequences for the United States. Judge, in retrospect, it might be a good thing that you and I didn't go to Russia, because I'm very fearful that while the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is underway, that a red line will be crossed and Russia will respond. And we will be looking at an outbreak of actual war between the United States and Russia. This is why I wanted to travel, because I was hopeful that by speaking to the Russian government, speaking to the Russian people, speaking to the Russian nation about the potential of the American people to do the right thing, come November, maybe vote in somebody who isn't hell-bent on going to war with Russia, that the Russians might not be inclined to act precipitously when we cross these red lines. But I was denied that opportunity by the U.S. government. And now, sadly, there's no voice in Russia right now, American voice, that can caution this. The U.S. embassy isn't. We don't have an American ambassador that's meeting with the Russians on a regular basis saying, this is all misunderstanding. What do we need to do to avoid war? We have a U.S. government together with NATO allies that think Russia's bluffing, and they are seeking to put as much pressure on Russia as possible prior to this peace summit that's being convened by Ukraine and Switzerland in the middle of this month, a peace summit that's falling apart before it even begins. But the operating notion is that we must convince Russia that we are serious about the consequences Russia will accrue if it continues a military engagement against Ukraine, that Russia's only choice is to be compelled to the peace table. Russia's not playing that game. Russia's playing the game of, we've won this war, and if you want to make it a broader war, we'll win that war too.
Here's how serious Russia takes it. Here's another statement. This is a full screen. We don't have it on tape. From Foreign Minister Lavrov. I'll read it aloud for the benefit of those who are taking the show audio only. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on May 30th. We do not rule out additional steps in the sphere of nuclear deterrence, because our command centers and the locations of our nuclear forces will be in range of American forward-based missiles. This is about as serious as you can get.
There's a lot of Americans out there, they're in the armchair warrior category, who are like, unleash the ATACMS. The ATACMS, of course, is the long range, up to 300-kilometer range missile that we have provided to the Ukrainians. Ray McGovern, and next time you have Ray on, you can talk to him about this, has highlighted some of the negotiations are taking place between the Russians and the United States before the initiation of the special military operation. And the Russians kept saying, we can't let NATO into Ukraine because we can't allow American missiles into Ukraine, because a lot of these Russian facilities, command centers, etc., that Russia uses were conceptualized and constructed during the Soviet Union when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So from a Russian perspective, they were deep in the Russian rear, protected. But if Ukraine now is carved out, made part of NATO, and you insert American missiles there, all of these places that were thought to be safe in the rear are now reachable. And if America allows Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles to strike these facilities, Russia will nuke NATO, not Ukraine, NATO.
Of course, Scott is right about that, because the attacks will actually be coming from NATO. Scott will get into that in just a second.
And this is what Lavrov just said. If you do this, now, according to the Ukrainians, they're complaining that the United States will only allow them to use the HIMARS, that they won't be allowed to use the ATACMS to strike Russia yet. But just so everybody in your audience understands, we are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying. We are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying.
And I have to add here, the president and those supposedly in control in Washington, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, may think that they have control, but there are operational people, who are on the ground, that is U.S. people inside, of Ukraine, who may take it upon themselves to work with the Ukrainians to launch an attack and to knock out a very important target, inside of Russia, essentially demanding retaliation by the Russians. Our people in Washington don't have such tight control over the people on the ground in Ukraine, including the American people, in Ukraine, that an accident cannot happen. There's risk to all of us from having the ATACMS and having the ATACMS attack Russian nuclear installations and nuclear sites.
Russians aren't playing games here.
The Russians will, and they will be well-grounded morally and legally, attack the places from which the missiles came, to which the missiles were delivered, at which their accelerant facilities are stored and repaired. And many Americans who are manning those facilities. Do we have any idea how many Americans are dead already? Didn't the Russians recently attack some NATO facility, and you hear nothing, with 100 people died, and you hear nothing about it in the West?
Colonel McGregor gave that story yesterday in his appearance, on the show, and said that 100 people were killed, and many of them, were American officers in that attack, in the Lviv area. Now, the Russians had a perfect right to make that particular attack. It was inside, of Ukraine. So there's nothing wrong here from the legal standpoint of the Russians making that attack.
Well, I'm always a little leery of these reports about the magic Russian missile that hit an underground bunker, because there's no reason for NATO, the United States, to hazard NATO members or American members. Remember, I talked about that safe haven. Why put 300 people into Ukraine in a bunker when you could have 300 people in Poland in a bunker that's not going to get hit by a Russian missile and have the same connectivity? So,
right. And Scott has a point there, because, when you go to Lviv, which is in the western part, of Ukraine, it's not very far to Poland. I don't know how many miles it is, but it's a relatively few miles to get to Poland. So it would be very easy to have a bunker in Poland instead.
I always view these reports as a little suspicious, and it just makes no sense that from a force protection standpoint, I can't see any American or NATO member allowing that many Americans or NATO officials to congregate in one place on Ukrainian soil, knowing that the Russians would find it and destroy it. I do believe the Russians did take out an underground facility. It's a facility that was used by the Ukrainians. There may have been some NATO advisors or contracted personnel, but the idea of 300 Americans and NATO's soldiers or officials dying in one attack, I just think it's far-fetched and just part of.
Okay, I should mention that what Doug McGregor said was that 100 people were killed, not that 100 Americans were killed. And that's far from the 300 people that Scott is talking about here. So there are differences in details and their understanding, okay, of what happened.
Of the fiction that often appears on social media.
Do you think Russia would attack Berlin, Paris, London?
Russia has said they will attack Berlin, Paris, London, Brussels. Russia will attack the decision-making centers associated with any attack against Russia that Russia deems to represent an existential threat. Let's get back to the ATACMS. The ATACMS system uses a guidance system, a GPS guidance system backed by an inertial guidance system that requires specific information to be loaded into the system. That can only be done by an American. I'll just repeat that one more time. That can only be done by an American.
Got to be top secret, whatever it is.
And now it's not just, now we get to the next part. That information will be transmitted from collection platforms, overhead satellites, drones, other ground and air breathing intelligence collection resources. They collect data. That data goes to a center inside Poland or in Germany, where that data is collated and then used to create a target, model of data against a specific target. What target's going to be attacked, how they're going to attack it, with what, from where. That data then is put together into a target package, which is transmitted again using top secret, communications channels that the Ukrainians don't have access to. So we have somebody on the ground in Ukraine receiving this package from somebody who planned it outside of Ukraine, and then they will put it into the missile, and then the Ukrainians do the last part, which is to push the button and launch it. But every other aspect was done by American hands, and the Russians know this. And so wherever in Europe this planning is taking place, this collation of intelligence data, this communication of targeting data, these are now legitimate targets that Russia will take out, either conventionally or, if required, using nuclear weapons. And if the Germans are party to this, Macron needs to understand if the Ukrainians use the French-provided Scout missiles, the same thing applies. The targeting data that goes inside can only be put in place by a French actor. There's the missile I used to inspect, and that is a game changer. If that's ever used in anger, we will lose 1 to 3 American cities.
Do the Russians have missile capability that we cannot intercept or neutralize? Yes,
pretty much every modern Russian missile is designed to evade American and NATO missile defense. On the strategic level, they have hypersonic missiles. They have maneuvering hypersonic warheads. They have similar capabilities at the tactical and what's called intermediate level. We can't defend against this. And the bottom line is, if the Russians launch the missiles, those missiles will hit the targets they're aimed at. And if those targets, if those missiles have nuclear weapons, those nuclear weapons will detonate where they're supposed to. And this will be devastating. It will be the end of Europe at a minimum, and potentially the end of the United States and the end of Russia and the end of the world.
I have to add here that the Russians also have ICBMs, as we do. There's no defense against those ICBMs. Our air defense systems are not able to knock them out. We spent a huge amount of money trying to develop air defense systems that would knock out ICBMs. Supposedly, we've spent $1 trillion trying to build anti-ballistic missile systems that would work, but the bottom line is they don't.
Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Austin, etc., President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, understand the gravity of this moment as you've explained it? Or are they just propagandists?
You know, I used to have a friend named William Polk, and I say used to because tragically he passed away a couple of years ago. But William Polk was a man who was in the inner circle for John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he talks about, and he's talked to me many times about the decision making that was going on and the role that Kennedy played in preventing a nuclear war, the maturity Kennedy had as a leader. Part of that maturity came from when Kennedy was first briefed on what was then called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the SIOP, the American War Plan. He went to the Pentagon and they briefed him. They said, this is, if we go to nuclear war, this is what we got. And basically, it was premised on the notion that America will be the largest surviving civilization, but in order to guarantee that, we have to kill everybody in the world. And he came out and said, that's insane. I'm not doing that. And he turned to his advisor, he said, and we call ourselves the human race. And he said, you have to give me options. Every president since then, or up until George W. Bush, reacted the same way. When they first got that briefing on how America plans to go to war, which is to destroy the entire world so that when the 20 to 30% of America that survives will be the largest remaining civilization cluster in the world, guaranteeing American global dominance in a post-nuclear conflict, insanity. They all said the same thing, insane, give me options. I can't go to that. You can't make me do this. You have to give me options. And the Pentagon always gave them options that inevitably led to that. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans have downplayed their nuclear war plan. We detargeted our missiles. Nothing was automatic anymore. We were heading in a path of, getting rid of nuclear weapons. And then George W. Bush came in a post 9/11 environment and said, we will use our nuclear weapons to ensure that a 9/11 never happens again. And we reinserted nuclear war planning into our military doctrine. And today we have that same mindset, that same nuclear war strategy without the maturity of John F. Kennedy. We have people who look at the plan and say, well, that's just a plan. We're not really going to do that. And they say the Russians are bluffing. We don't have to worry about this. The problem is the second something happens and that plan is pulled out, the dust is blushed off, and we start pushing buttons, we go to the scenario that John F. Kennedy said was insanity. Judge, we're going to blow up the entire world because we know that in a post-nuclear environment, we can't allow, for instance, India to survive intact because we're going to be reduced to 30% of our capacity. We can't allow India to have a superior civilization in a post-nuclear conflict. We're going to destroy the entire world. That's what the American nuclear war plan is. And the American people need to wake up and understand it's on full automatic. Full automatic.
You see why the state.
Well, so there we are again. In the context of the warning by Larry Johnson and earlier warnings by Scott Ritter, also Colonel McGregor, Jeff Sachs, so many others. We have to get away from this madness. It is too risky. It is too risky for us. There will be an accident that will happen, and we will all be gone. Most of us at the present time don't even know that the government is risking our lives in this way. They don't even know it. Let's get to the end.
Almost at CIA, but I see why the State Department's afraid of you because you speak the truth. because you give an understanding that the government doesn't want people to have. And a 45-year-old JFK had more maturity, understanding, and grasp of morality than an 81-year-old, barely competent Joe Biden. Scott, no matter what we talk about, it's a pleasure to talk to you. You are an American treasure, as I wrote in a blurb for your forthcoming book. I mean it from all my heart. And we'll do some battle together against the State Department. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for being you.
Thank you, Judge, for having me on, and I look forward to working with you down the road.
Of course.
Okay, so that's that particular video. I intended to do more, but as I got into that video and talking about it with you, I realized I didn't want to miss a minute of it without having the opportunity to analyze, okay, and to comment on it. And especially in the context of Larry Johnson's warning, it is so important. Now, I planned tonight to go over to a video by Larry Wilkerson. That was a much longer video. Of course, I won't have time to do that, okay, tonight. So I'm going to take that on in tomorrow's show, okay, the Thursday night show. And I also had an article by Pepe Escobar to go over, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to postpone that as well, okay, until tomorrow, because I'm due over at the D. Pierce site to help her with her video, which will probably be on Israel-Palestine, okay, tonight. So I'll be going there in just a few minutes. I do want to consider your latest comments. No, I don't know who else is on that Ukrainian kill list. I suspect, but don't know for sure, that Larry Johnson is on it, okay, as well. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Colonel McGregor is also on it. I wouldn't be surprised if Jeff Sachs is on it. I mean, it's ridiculous. That kill list is ridiculous. Okay, so Nancy Perot. I don't know if she pronounces it Perot or Peralt. Just thinking back to Gonzalo Limber, they allowed him to keep talking, didn't they? Remember what Scott said about that? Yes, I do remember what Scott said about that. But also, eventually, he kept talking for a while, but eventually they killed him. So there's that. Scott did a particular analysis and broke ranks from the rest of folks who were sympathetic to Gonzalo Lira, because he thought that, since after arresting Gonzalo, they allowed him to get out and continue to stream. Scott was sure, based on his familiarity with the way intelligence people operate, that this actually meant that he had to be someone who was working for the Ukrainian government. In saying this, Scott departed from everyone else who thought that Gonzalo was completely sincere. Okay, so Scott had a different opinion. I don't condemn Scott for that particular opinion. He's had a lot of experience, okay, in the intelligence area. He pieced things together, okay, in a particular way. I don't know whether he was right, okay, or wrong. I didn't really have the expertise to evaluate that, but I do remember what Scott said. I think there are some 40 U.S. citizens on that list. I've never seen the list, though, okay, so I don't know, but there are reportedly 40 U.S. citizens on that list. So that's all for me for tonight. I'm going to go over to Dee's program now to help her out. I'll be back tomorrow night with more warnings, specifically the Larry Wilkerson video, which is an interview, with Nima Alkershid, is an excellent video. Also, it's a devastating analysis of our foreign policy. It deals a little bit with Israel, but mostly with the Ukrainian situation, puts it in historical context. It's a wonderful video. I'm going to do analysis and commentary on that tomorrow night. I'm also going to finally get to an article by Pepe Escobar on the normalization of Afghanistan and its likely integration into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. So that should be a very, very interesting show tomorrow night, and I urge you to join me for that show. Right now, I'm going to leave here and go over to Dee's, and I urge you to follow me over to Dee's show, Around the World with Dee and Friends. I don't have the link here right offhand, but you can look it up, on YouTube. And so good night for now, and I'll see you tomorrow.